a lot of folks come to us and say, hey, I want to get this high deductible plan. So I get an HSA. And I'm like, that's fancy. It's a nice tax break. But then if an emergency hits, you got a $13,000 out of pocket limit. People are like, I'm never going to hit that. My wife actually just went for some lab testing, and the insurance company was supposed to cover it. It was pre-approved, but turns out the pre-approval was processed after the blood was drawn. So like, nope, we're not going to cover it. Okay. The bill comes. That one lab test is $6,800. I'll tell you right now, I'm fighting with the insurance company. I'm fighting with but not planned. What's really weird about that is the insurance company did agree to pay for it, but it's just the timing of which came first. It are these things. So you have to make sure you not only have the emergency fund, but you have the right insurance, the right levels, and you've protected yourself.
Yeah. Checking those and checking them regularly too. Welcome to the Childfree Wealth Podcast, hosted by Bree and Dr. J, certified financial planner. Here we discuss life and finances as it relates to being child-free. This podcast is for educational and entertainment purposes only. Please consult your advisor before implementing any ideas heard on this podcast.
So the core question is, what do you do first? Like, do you invest first? Do you build an emergency fund? Do you keep cash around? Like, what are kind of the order of operations? And at what point have you kind of put the cart before the horse? Like, have you missed it? Have you gone in a different direction? And we bring this topic up because we see it frequently when we're doing child-free wealth checkups of really people that have done great work on investing, but missed the basics. Or, they've got a very fancy plan when a very simple plan would work. So Bree, kind of talk to me about like some of the things you've seen in the recent time.
One of the biggest things I see is people who are bringing in $250,000 a year or more, and they're doing a good job. They have lots of money in investments. They're making a lot. They're being able to live the life they want to live, but they don't have things like an emergency fund or cash set aside, or their money's tied up in different things where they really can't get to it easily if they need it. And that is so incredibly common. If I had $1 for every time that happened, I'd be retired by now. It's one of those conversations that I often have is, yes, you're bringing in a lot now, but what if something happens and something goes wrong and that income stops and you need to get cash quickly? What are you going to do then?
Yeah. And I think one of those like kind of stats that surprises people is there's still a pretty considerable percentage of folks that are making over 6 figures a year that are living paycheck to paycheck. And sometimes that's self-imposed, like either from their lifestyle or what they want to save for investing, or you'll see it folks in the FIRE community where like every single penny is getting saved or locked up in a retirement account or whatever else it is. And they have no space for what happens if, and let's be real, we're in a year where what happens if is a regular thing. Like, who knows? And I think the challenge is because you get another paycheck next week, you're like, well, if something bad happened, I could pay for it. But that paycheck's not always guaranteed.
Yeah, paychecks can stop for any number of reasons. And many people have found that out, whether it's through layoffs this past year or whether it be through medical things. There are things that happen that are very real and very big. That means paychecks stop. And we see that. And that's part of the reason we are so adamant about you really need to have cash on hand and have some sort of emergency fund. It doesn't matter what your income level is. Having money to get through those expenses is incredibly important to give you a buffer and give you some breathing room, because it's stressful when things go wrong and now you're trying to scramble. And if you've got money locked up in a retirement fund, then yeah, sure, you can sometimes get it out, but that's going to come with a bunch of extra fees and penalties that are really just unnecessary, as if you instead had that money in cash.
Yeah, but there is such a thing as having too much cash on the flip side. We usually say 3 to 6 months in an emergency fund. And I had somebody the other day, I was doing in the middle of all that Fed stuff with the layoffs and, everything with the jobs. I was doing a Q&A with Fed folks. And they're like, hey, I don't really know where my job's going to go. Is it okay for me to have a bigger emergency fund right now? Like a 6 to 12 month instead of 3 to 6. I'm like, yeah, absolutely. If like rough times are coming, which is your job, your life, your family, whatever it is, just saving some money extra to kind of have it in their cash in a high yield savings makes a lot of sense. On the flip side, you also don't want to have 2 or 3 years of expenses in your quote unquote emergency fund.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I've seen that too, where times where we call out, hey, you have too much. Usually, though, at least from my perspective, what I've seen is the people who have too much aren't going, well, I make enough that it doesn't matter. They have too much because they grew up with a very scarcity mindset. And so they have a lot in cash because it makes them feel comfortable, and they really haven't worked through those scarcity mindset things yet.
I think it's also a false sense of security on both sides. So on one side, you're saying, hey, I feel good because I've got enough money coming in. I can be able to handle emergency, this and the other. I don't need an emergency fund. On the flip side, the other people are like, hey, I got to save every penny because emergencies happen. I'm going to be safer there. And both of those are not right. And it's kind of like, I've been talking a lot lately about mindlessly saving or mindlessly spending. And both of those are extremes. You can actually save too much. You can spend too much. People usually, on social media talk too much about spending too much, but it's possible to have too much. So when I look at an emergency fund, 3 to 6 months of your expenses. And now we get people like, some people are like, oh, well, my expenses are $5,000 a month. And I'll say, okay, how'd you come up with that number? And like, well, I took everything I spent last month, totaled it up. This is what I spent. That's the correct answer. If on the other hand, they're like, well, if I had an emergency, I'd cut this out. I would do this. I might change that. I'm like, we're making fake numbers now. You have to use what you're really spending. You will cut back in an emergency, but you also have to have a realistic number of your expenses. And the other challenge is some people just don't know what their monthly expenses are.
Yeah, and you're so right. For both of those, I just had a conversation yesterday with somebody, they were the first bucket of people bringing in a lot of money every year. And I said, your emergency fund is a bit low. And they're like, well, we'd cut back on this and this. And I said, okay, that's great. There are some things you'd cut back on, but do you really want to cut back your grocery budget and be eating rice and beans every day if something happens? Probably not. Not unless you really have to. You've got enough of a disparity there between what you're telling me your expenses are and what you're saying your expenses are in an emergency that we should beef that up a little bit. You've got the wiggle room to do it, because the reality is, how many of us, when we have something bad happen, are necessarily looking to cut back? That's usually when we spend more. I know I spend more in times where I'm not feeling so great because maybe I don't want to cook or do whatever. I spend money out of comfort at times.
And it's not always like you lose your job. The emergency fund is like for all of those life things that happen. When people ask me kind of, how do I know 3 or 6 months? We can start with the job. And I used to say, hey, if you have a great secure job, like a federal job or a university job where you're never going anywhere, you might go to 3 months. That answer, by the way, has completely changed this year. Like I'm no longer on that. But I also will ask people, are you kind of a lucky person by nature? Which isn't really a scientific math finance question, but you know what I'm talking about. There are some people where like just life happens, stuff happens, it does. And then we call it luck or not, but like, if you're one that regularly runs into emergencies or not. And there is some correlation between when you're like first getting out of debt, you've got limited money, you are not doing the quote unquote preventative maintenance stuff, even on your body, like going to the doctor regularly, all the things. And that makes you unlucky because you have not done the maintenance. So that may be part of it. But otherwise, sometimes it's just your situation. I've shared, hey, I've taken care of my mother one way or another for most of my life. It's normal for me to get a phone call. It's usually from my sister, and we'll have the conversation like, mom's in the hospital. And I'm like, okay, do I need to be there today? And she's like, well, this one, yes, this one, no. Okay, dropping everything, booking a plane ticket or driving or whatever. I mean, that's normal for me. So I need to have a little more emergency fund for those things to happen. There are other folks where their job's very steady. They don't really have they're not unlucky. They're not getting called out randomly. Maybe they can go with 3 months on the emergency fund. But I'm never going to go zero emergency fund.
Yeah, zero emergency fund is really putting yourself in a place where it can be tricky. And I'm not saying zero emergency fund because things have happened and you're trying to get there, but it's not happening. This is like intentionally going, I'm not having an emergency fund. That's risky. But also saying, hey, my emergency fund is in investments, also real risky. And I think that's where sometimes people will get caught up is, well, I have enough in investments, I'm fine. Not necessarily, because what if something happens and the market is down? That's when you have your emergency. You got to pay penalties to get it out. That's a tough situation to be in.
Or let's go a little more catastrophic. Hey, it's in the market, and the market has, whatever reason, has a shutdown day. Something happens tech-wise, whatever else. Like, you don't have access to the money. What I like about keeping your money in a high-yield savings account, it's at a bank, it's FDIC insured, it's got to be there when you need it. Even if it's not, the insurance from FDIC will cover it. If things go really bad somewhere in the economy, you're okay. And then somebody say to me, well, but I'm not earning a lot of money on my high yield savings account. I'm like, that's okay. Your money has a job, and that job is to be there when you need it. That's it. Like, it's not made to like make a lot of money. I don't need a giant cash cushion there just to have it. I want to have it in a high yield savings account where I can get access to immediately, not a CD where I have to sell the CD, not in the market where the market whims. I want to have it there. I also personally go towards having about $1,000 in cash in an emergency fund. Why? Because credit cards don't always work. Yes, you have some risk because having the cash and somebody can steal it from your place, but you don't know how many times that's happened. Like, actually, when I was in Connecticut, we had a massive, massive snowstorm come in and a bunch of power lines down, all that. All of the credit card terminals in the area didn't work. So if you went to the gas station to get gas for your generator, which I did, they're like, cash only. And I'm like, no problem. And like, you can see everybody in line going, what do we do? Like, and I'm like, you take the green things out of your pocket and hand them over. But that's just not the way people think. I mean, are you following me, Bree?
Yeah. I mean, last week I went to a pizza place and they were like, oh, cash only, as I was grabbing my credit card. I just paused for a second and went, oh, yeah, thank God I had some cash on me. But yeah, having pizza is not an emergency.
Some days it is. My wife loves pizza enough that if I don't get her the right one in the right time, that is an emergency.
I've been there. Chicken nuggets, of course. But having cash on hand, I was going to bring that up too, is it can be really important to have that and go through, because I remember, one of the very first podcast episodes we ever did together is we talked a little bit about that. And yeah, Venmo doesn't work. Credit cards don't work. All those things don't work if power is out for whatever reason. And having that cash, which many of us don't think about anymore, is so incredibly important. It doesn't have to be a lot, $1,000, like you said, just enough to pay for something if, things go wrong. Having it accessible, easy to get, that's always going to be step one, is just getting that starter emergency fund, that 1 month of expenses. And that's what we tell everybody. If you meet with us at all, I'm sure there are plenty of people listening to us who have said, yep, I've met with them and they have said this before to me, of beef up the emergency fund, and just really starting there is always going to be where we recommend.
Yeah. And so we're going back to that no baby steps. And step 1 is a starter emergency fund. Step 2 is getting out of debt. Step 3 is a fully funded emergency fund. And we skipped over kind of that number 2 of getting out of debt. And it's interesting. Some of the folks that have a very good, income coming in, I'm surprised by the amount of debt they have too. And there's not like a magic equation. If I make X dollars, then I won't have debt, or I'll have the emergency fund done, or I'll have the basics done. It has to do with your mindset around money, and are you managing it? Where sometimes, folks, I don't know if this is you, but you kind of keep your head down. You don't know what's going on. You're not looking at your balances. You don't have a clue what's going on. You just kind of keep swiping the card. That mindless spending adds up pretty quick. And now we're not paying off the bill every month. Like, it can get there. On the flip side, we had a lot of folks that had a good plan for student loan forgiveness. That's gone. So like, I'm looking at debt as an emergency, and then we get to emergency fund, and then we'll get to the emergency fund. Then we get to investment. Like, there is an order for a reason.
And one thing to point out too, there is getting some of that debt paid off can greatly reduce the amount that you need to have an emergency fund, because now you're not having to worry about making those payments every single month. Many times, if I'm talking with somebody who has a lot of debt, I'll go through and I'll calculate, hey, this is what your emergency fund would be at 3 to 6 months now. If you got your debt paid off, this is what it would be. And those numbers seem a lot more manageable because they don't have those required bills going out every month anymore.
Yeah. And I think for our soloists in the audience, I'm okay if your answer is just automatically 6 months of expenses because you don't have someone else to rely on. Like, it's about your situation. I will say a lot of times when I see like people have way too much cash, it is the soloists. We're like, I've got to feel safe. I've got to have more money in cash. I'm like, you went too far. Going past 6 months, unless there's an emergency coming or you think there's an issue with your job or whatever else, you can now have so much in cash that you're not keeping up with inflation. And that's a balancing act. So like, I'm okay with a little more caution. That's 6 months. Going to a year does not make you safer.
Yeah. You said if you think something's coming, one big thing is right now with everything going on, if you're going, hey, I have an emergency fund, but I also think something's going to happen and it's going to cause further expenses, plan for what that expense could be. And it's okay to set that aside if it helps you sleep at night. And because it's a very defined thing and very thought out. It's not just, I'm going to get to use stuff money aside just because. It's nope. I thought this through. I want to have this on hand. It just makes me feel better because I know that there's potential for whatever going on that could really upend my life at this point.
And in that case, it's not even a really emergency fund. It is I see something coming. This handles that. And my emergency fund is also still safe. For people that have seasonal work, like, hey, I get big checks in one season of the year, get small checks the other time. If I want to put a little like Hill and Valley account, a little extra money aside to handle those things, awesome. That's not necessarily an emergency account. An emergency is something that was not planned. If you're looking at things like, I think I'm going to leave my job in 6 weeks, that is planned. That's not an emergency. So you have to find a way to get that balance.
Yeah. And, even things like home maintenance and vehicle maintenance, all those things, people sometimes say, oh, that's an emergency. Well, no, that's a regular part of owning those things. I'm not one to suggest dipping into your emergency fund for that. I'm saying let's set some money aside for that and plan for that. Personally, I like to use sinking funds for those. Just every month, money gets set aside for those. And then when those expenses pop up, we don't know exactly when they're going to happen, but we know they're going to happen. Using that money instead of that emergency fund can give you some extra. And yeah, if you can cash flow it, you can do that. But sometimes it's nice to just not have to look at your expenses every month and going, this month was really high, this month was really low.
Yep. I mean, let's be real. A tree falls through your house, that's an emergency. Mm-hmm. A remodel of your kitchen is not.
Amen.
Just your stove catches on fire, you need to replace the appliance, the stove. That's an emergency. You go, well, now it doesn't match my fridge and I need to replace the fridge too. Not an emergency. And I'm using some silly examples, but I see this all the time where people are like, well, I can always dip into here. I can come back. No, then you probably need like a savings fund for home improvements. I think the other part of this is you need to build the rest of that safety net around you. We're really talking about the basics you need to get done before you kind of do a whole lot of stuff, invest and take a lot of risk. So for example, disability insurance. That's a must. For child-free folks, especially the soloists, it's a must. And people go, well, but I don't have the extra money for that. Well, then you got to find that before you go put a whole lot of money in investing. Because the reality check is you're more likely to get disabled than to make a whole lot of money in the market. Things happen. I had somebody early 50s had a stroke. Well, he's a lawyer. The likelihood that you're going to go back to work as a lawyer after having a stroke, very low. Let's just be real on that. And nothing he did, just strokes happen. Heart attacks happen. We could have a different discussion on health and, stress and all that. But if he did not have disability insurance, he would have been living on Social Security for his life. And I mean, even at the high side, Social Security disability is getting you like a couple grand a month. It's not enough to live on. And your emergency fund that's 6 months is going to go away in about that time. Because if you apply for Social Security disability, they have to go through a process. They're not paying you day one. They're going to actually deny you usually the first time. Then it's going to be 6 or 12 months. You do an appeal process. The good news is they'll pay you back to the day that you got disabled, but you've got to cover your bills for a year. Like, that's a problem. So yeah, I have my emergency fund. Do I have my disability insurance? Also, do I have homeowners insurance if I have a home? Do I have car insurance? Do I have health insurance? These are things that protect you from emergencies. A lot of folks come to us and say, hey, I want to get this high deductible plan, so I get an HSA. And I'm like, that's fancy. It's a nice tax break. But then if an emergency hits, you got a $13,000 out of pocket limit. People are like, I'm never going to hit that. My wife actually just went for some lab testing, and the insurance company was supposed to cover it. It was pre-approved, but turns out the pre-approval was processed after the blood was drawn. So like, nope, we're not going to cover it. Okay. The bill comes. That one lab test is $6,800. I'll tell you right now, I'm fighting with the insurance company. I'm fighting with not planned. What's really weird about that is the insurance company did agree to pay for it, but it's just the timing of which came first. It are these things. So you have to make sure you not only have the emergency fund, but you have the right insurance, the right levels, and you've protected yourself.
Yeah. Checking those and checking them regularly too, because I've seen a rash recently of people who have disability insurance and they don't realize that they have what's called modified own occupation insurance, which means, hey, if you become disabled, like the lawyer example you were talking about, you'll get paid for 24 months in these cases, they're typically 24 months at that disability rate. But after that, if you can do anything like work at the corner bookstore, they say, sorry, we're not paying you anymore. So checking those regularly is such a big part of having those as well, because you never know when those things are going to happen. And I feel like one question I also get is, well, I've hit FI already, hit financial independence. Do I still need to keep disability insurance? Absolutely you do, because there is a very, very small likelihood that you are counting right now your expenses at the same level of what they would be if you were to become disabled, because $6,800 for a lab test. Medical expenses are not cheap at all.
Yeah, and I think we also kind of trying to save, small dollars that can cost you big dollars in the future. Disability insurance, it can be relatively cheap, unless you're doing underwater welding, which is really high risk, that's going to be expensive. They always, as an example, they use a career in the other side of the least risky. They'll use a CPA. And I'm like, okay, fine. What's the worst? You got a paper cut, but I get it. No matter what it is, you need to have that protection. And this episode, I think if you take away one thing, it's that the order matters. So we have our 8 No Baby Steps program. We can link you to, if people are like, oh, I'm past that. And I'll go back and check off. And I'm like, you think you're past it. You think you're on step 6, but you skipped steps 1 through 3.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where they're like, but I thought I'm doing well. You are currently under the life you're living. And as long as nothing goes wrong. Yeah. That's the part that people are missing. And I think the other thing that I've got to warn folks of, we've had a great run of the market for a considerable period of time. For many of the folks listening here, you've been investing in one of the best runs of the market in a long, long time. We can get to periods like they talk about the lost decade, where essentially no growth for a decade in the market. We can have downturns for a considerable period of time. We have not been there. So what happens is people get a false sense of security because the market was up 20% last year. It's going to keep going up. No, it's not. It's on average, it returns 7 to 10% every year, but that's on average. So that tells you that the years where we've been having 20% gains, there's going to be some times when we don't. And I think you just go, oh, well, I'm fine. My investments aren't that risky. This has been going well for me. You're right. Until who knows what. Random things happen. The market does random things. Nobody could have predicted COVID. 30% drop in the market. You just can't do that. So you have to do the basics first.
If you enjoyed the show, please consider leaving a rating or review. We'd love to keep the conversation going. Please let us know your thoughts wherever comments are available or email us at media@childfreewealth.com. To stay up to date, find and follow Childfree Wealth on social media. If you're interested in working with us, learn more by visiting our website, childfreewealth.com. We'll see you next time.